Hi everyone. In this video we're going to discuss about a fundamental and a very important concept in Python. First of all, what is the core purpose of any program? We basically write instructions to perform different operations on data. Let's say for example you want to calculate simple interest using some formula, or let's say you want to store the details of a user to the database, or you might want to simply print some data to the console using print function. So basically we write instructions to perform different operations on data. Now the data we use in Python can be of different types. Some of the examples are integers. For example, here 10 minus 50, these are integers. And then we have strings. When we enclose something inside single quotes or double quotes, these are considered as strings. And then we also have something like a list, which is nothing but a collection of multiple elements. Here we have three integer elements. Here we have a string and an integer. We also have different other types of data as well, which we will discuss in future, but these are some of the examples. Now, one very important point we need to remember in Python is that every data we use in Python is an object, which means these integers, these strings or these lists, everything is stored in the form of an object in Python. In fact, inside this list object, all these elements are also objects. So these are integer objects. This is a string object. This is an integer object. So when we use these kind of values in our program, Python interpreter stores them in the form of objects and not as raw values. Now, what is the difference between raw value and an object? Let's try to understand that. For example, if we take integer 10 in other programming languages like Java, it is stored as a raw value, which means in the memory allotted for this integer, typically it is 32 bits in Java. The 32-bit representation of this integer 10 is stored in this memory location. So in this allotted memory, only this value 10 is stored, nothing else will be there. But when it comes to Python, even the basic data types like integers, floats, or even booleans, all these are objects. So this is how an integer object 10 is stored in memory. Object will not only have this value 10, it will have a much more complex structure with so many components inside it. This is just a simplified representation of integer object, but in reality, there might be so many other things inside this object as well. And these are some of the important components that we can find inside an object. So firstly, every object will have something called ID, which is nothing but the address of an object. And then it will have a type. So this 10 is an integer object, so the type will be int. So this type is also nothing but the class of an object. Basically in Python, every object is associated to a class, which is also called as type of an object. We will be discussing about classes and objects in detail in object-oriented programming, but just to give you a brief context, a class is like a blueprint of an object. It tells us what kind of data will be present in the object and what kind of operations we can do on this object. And all the integer objects, they belong to a class called int. In the same way, the other types of data will also be associated to some class. We will be discussing about different data types in the upcoming lectures. So an object will have ID and then type, and then it will also have the actual data value, which is 10 in this case. And then there is also one more interesting field called reference count. And what do we mean by reference count? Basically, when it comes to objects, a single object can be referred at multiple locations in our program. So reference count gives us the count of number of references to this particular object. All right. We will be discussing about references many times in this course, so you will understand this further in future videos. Now, as I told you, every object is associated to a class, which is also called type. We have a function called type in Python, which will give us the type of an object. Also in Python, type, class or data type, they all mean the same thing. So for this integer object 10, you can say the type or class or data type is int. Now let's see all these objects in action using a small demo. So in this project, I'm creating a new Python file and let me call this as data objects. All right. So it has created data objects.py. Now here, let me simply add a print function to simply print this integer 10. Now if you try to run this program, it will print this value 10 to the console. But what happens behind the scenes is when Python interpreter executes this instruction, it will create an integer object with value 10 in memory and then gives this object to print function. Then print function will print the value of this object to the console. Now we can find the type of the object by using type function in Python. So let's print type of 10. Now if we execute this program, right click, run data objects, we can see something like this is printed, which indicates that this object 10 belongs to a class int. As I mentioned before, in Python, class or type or data type, they all mean the same thing. Now similarly, we can use other kinds of objects like strings. For example, let's say here I'm trying to print this Python string, right? So I'll put this string inside this print function. Then what happens? Python interpreter will create a string object with value Python and it will give this object to the print function. Then print function will display this value to the console. Let's also print type of this string Python. Now let's try to run this program. Now as you can see, it prints Python and in the next line it prints the type of this string Python, which is str. It belongs to a class called str. And we can also do different types of operations on these objects. For example, let's say I want to find the value of 10 plus 20. I can put this inside print function. And in the same way, we can also use some sort of string operations. Let's say I want to concatenate two strings, hello and world, right? So when we add plus between two numerical values, it will be addition. And when we put it between two strings, it will be string concatenation. Now when Python interpreter executes this instruction, it will create integer objects 10 and 20. In fact, even the evaluated value, which is 30, will also be stored in the form of an object and not as a raw value. So even the expressions in Python will eventually produce Python objects. So the expression 10 plus 20 will produce an integer object 30, which will be given to this print function. Similarly, if you take this example, when Python interpreter executes this instruction, it will create two string objects, hello and world. And even the evaluated string after concatenation, which will be a single string hello world, will also be stored in the form of an object. So this will produce a new string object hello world, which is given to the print function. Now if you try to run this, you can see that this will print 30 and this will print a string hello world. Also, one thing you might often notice is that even though all these integers or strings, all these are objects in Python, but in common language, we might simply call them as values. Even though for the sake of simplicity, we might address them as values, always remember at the back of your mind that all data values are actually objects in Python. Understanding the concept of objects is really important, especially when we learn advanced concepts in Python like immutability or internal working of lists or even object-oriented programming. So till now we discussed a lot about creation of various objects, and when will these objects be created? During the execution of the program. So when Python interpreter executes these instructions, it will temporarily create these objects in main memory, which means in our RAM. The objects will not get permanently stored in our hard disk. They are only created temporarily during the execution of the program. So once our program execution is over, all these objects will be deleted and the memory will be freed up. Also, Python does something interesting when it comes to integer objects. So when we execute the program, what happens? Firstly, Python interpreter gets executed by the CPU. So as soon as Python interpreter starts up, It will automatically create integer objects from range -5 to 256 and temporarily store them in computer's memory. This process is also called caching. Before even starting execution of these instructions, Python interpreter will by default create integer objects within this range. And what is the benefit of caching these integer objects? So generally, these integers in this range are very frequently used in our programs. By creating these integer objects beforehand, Python interpreter need not again create them while executing these instructions in which these integer objects are used. So it will help in executing these instructions much faster. So when we use these objects like 10, 20 or any other integers between this range, they will not be again created because these are already created and stored in memory. So simply those objects are reused. This is something Python interpreter does as a part of its efficient memory management. You don't have to worry about it. As a programmer, even if you assume that all these objects are created during the execution process, that will not affect how the program behaves. Reusing objects is something Python interpreter takes care behind the scenes, alright? Till now in these examples, we are directly printing the values to the console, by putting them inside print function. But many a times what we generally do is we assign these values to some variables like these so that we can reuse these variables whenever required. So in the next tutorial, let's discuss about Python variables in detail. I'll see you there.